Oh my gosh. Welcome everyone to our study of the Buddhist Psychology of Awakening by Steven Goodman. And before we're getting into what Abhidharma famously is about, all the different mental events, mental factors, and so on, we're looking at some of the basic assumptions around the mind. And probably the most important thing is what we looked at last time, which is, and this is something that's, you could say, eternally mind-boggling, but what seems to be phenomena and seem to be solid phenomena actually lack solidity, they lack identity, and obviously they lack permanence. But you see, more than permanence, lacking permanence, they actually lack actual reality. Now, we're not denying that there is a sofa, we're not denying that there's a person, but what we're interested in is that thing which drives our suffering and our confusion, which is us, you could say, labeling what is in fact just moments, instantaneous moments. Let's just stick with the present Abhidharma vocabulary. Present moments of perception as having some inherent identity, and that's what phenomena don't have. In Mahayana, we go a bit further. We would say anything that is conditioned has never actually come into existence. And that means that while we certainly relatively, yes, we have all the things that are there. The Dalai Lama will take an airplane, the Dalai Lama will get up at 4 in the morning or whatever. But we're at the same time saying that nothing within time and space actually has ever attained any kind of existence from its own side. So when I label a sofa, it's just me who's labeling, you could say, a conglomeration of passing phenomena, this particular label. And that we could say, okay, that makes sense according to the math, but it's more than just the math. It's more than just the theory of it. It's that this is actually where we begin to say, that's good, that's bad, he is bad, he's good, she, that, I like, I don't like. That's where we label things, and that's where we need to actually humbly be aware that we're doing this. Otherwise, this just becomes a very cerebral philosophical enterprise, and that's not interesting, and that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because this has actual impact in terms of how we are interacting with our perceptions, and that's where this is important. So I'm going to Steven's text then. We're now looking at, so last time we looked at, let's just see here. Yeah, there was this, last time I insisted on going over the little part which is about what we call the four extremes. This is where we tend to think that phenomena actually have come into existence, that they actually exist as such. And that's where Nagarjuna says that, do things truly exist? No. Do they truly not exist? Is there such a thing as non-existence? Not either. And so the whole idea of trying to label things in terms of having some existence or non-existence is entirely just our doing. And phenomena don't exist as such in and of themselves. And this is what we're going to look at today in terms of how do phenomena actually exist in and of themselves, apart from our labeling. And that's where we're going beyond anything that has to do with Buddhism. We're going beyond anything that has to do with any, you could say, human or otherwise method of labeling and characterizing and conceptualizing things. So this is a very interesting project. It hopefully makes sense. But in doing so, we're first going to look at the various kinds of subjectivities. So this is where we look at personality types and basic temperaments. So that's where we're at. So Steven says, what does Buddhist thought say about personality types or basic temperaments? The Buddhist tradition might have the earliest recorded classification of personality. It's called a designation of human types. And it's one of the Abhidharma texts in the Abhidharma, in the Pali canon. So that's Pugala Panyati. And there is a translation of that, the designation of human types, translated in 1992. So anyway, this would be, like he says, one of the earliest recorded classifications of personality. So if that's from the Pali Canon, this would be sort of late, before the Common Era. Anyway, the term for human types is, in this text, is personality, Pudgala. This term is a name for any kind of fixity, a reference point, or habit that we rely on. As we've already discussed, cutting through this fixity or habit is, in part, the goal of Buddhist study and practice. For as long as we're bound to such reference point of self, me, and mine, we keep the wheel of suffering turning in full swing. So remember, this is really why we're doing this. This is not about the philosophy or the sort of interesting philosophical ramifications of deconstruction or what we might sort of like to sort of ponder and discuss and so on. This is really just getting at the core of what really drives misery throughout the entire universe, and that is this fixity. This is the very core of delusion. So what do Buddhists, I guess I should say, what do Buddhists say about the variety of personality types? The ancient text, the designation of human types, state that there are three basic personality types. You're either a greed type, a hate type, or an ignorance type. These are character or personality types, karmic habits deeply rooted in early development. We can imagine them as orientation and survival strategies, like Western notion of humors as discussed by Paracelsus, melancholic, choleric, what do we call it? Bilic, yeah, and sanguine. As such, they are not to be conflated with overt displays of anger, greed, or confusion, expressions of upset, which might arise in different circumstances. These three possible temperaments are more deep-seated. They're congenital and constitutive. Constitutive, yes. A materialist who only believes in the material reality of things might say they are genetic. So, of course, from a Buddhist point of view, we would say this is something that has been constructed over a long time of lifetimes and basically is embedded within the all-ground, the alaya vijnana. But, of course, in the materialist context, we would sort of situate this within the brain. Greed type. So that's the first. A person who is a greed type or who has a greed temperament is one whose dominant pattern, sense of reality, and sense of normalcy is created and maintained by a style of responsiveness characterized by greed. Why so? How does this work? Here, greed is the general tendency from childhood up through adulthood to feel most affirmed, real, and normal when one is allowed to absorb or merge with when one is allowed to absorb or merge with what is presented as an experience, or to merge or absorb into an experience with no blockage or hesitation. For such temperaments, this is the normal, most comfortable way of responding in everyday situations. We might call such types blenders or mergers. When they're allowed to do that, they feel good and normal. For them, it is the most natural way of responding. It corresponds to how they experience the world, themselves, and other people. They tend to choose their careers and friends according to what is most in accord with such responsiveness. For such types, any interruption, any suggestion that something might impede that blending or merging is often experienced as a confirmation of a disconfirmation of who they are, and so it's unsettling and potentially disturbing. So, of course, we have all sorts of, within psychology and also within Vajrayana, we have various kinds of personality types that we might sort of associate with this. But anyway, greed here doesn't necessarily mean just sort of blatant greed in the conventional sense, but it's more just what possibly in the Vajrayana context we would talk about as Padma family. those that sort of like phenomena and like to engage with phenomena. So they have more of an approach which is soft, and more their style of operating is more about winning people in, or drawing people in the sense that they'd like to blend with them. So that's the first kind, and of course that sort of falls more in the, if we were to say these three categories fall into the three basic reactionary patterns like attachment, aversion, and ignorance, this is obviously attachment. Then there's the hate type. Okay. Again, the way these are sort of these the name we're using for these typifications are a little bit sort of strong, but that might very well be the original text that uses these kind of terms. So similarly, also, for example, when we talk about attachment and aversion in Tibetan, we say chagdang, which actually means, chak does mean desire, and dang actually does mean anger. So, but of course, what's implicit here when we say greed and hate is not so much the sort of the nth degree of these sentiments, but it's more just attachment, or you could say like and dislike. So of course, we have a whole spectrum in that. So hate type, such green types tend to have stylistic conflicts with those of a hate temperament. A hate type doesn't mean one is running around being angry. The hate type is the most spacious, most happy, most real and normal, because they have a great capacity to emotionally create distance from a new experience. That allows them the space to analyze, to make distinctions, and to note differences in the sudden onslaught of experiences. The hate type could be called the separator, the distancer. They become claustrophobic when asked to take things just as they are, not to ask questions and not to go into things. No matter which type we are, we can all learn which situations shut us down and which situations open us up. A hate type is in contradistinction to a greed type. A hate type's sense of reality is affirmed through pushing away and resisting the way in which reality is presented at first glance. They are not accepting it just like this. This is energetically the opposite of the greed type. So there also within Vajrayana, we talk more about the Vajra, the mirror-like quality of just assessing the nature of things without necessarily getting entangled, without necessarily involving or engaging, but more just sort of coolly seeing how things are. So that has that sort of analytical element. So Steven continues, let's give a concrete example of an interaction between a hate type and a greed type. One day, a greed type was reading a book and said to their friend, a hate type, "This book is fantastic." Then that friend picked up the recommended book and noticed such things as, when was it written? Oh, that means it's about 10 years out of date. What's the bibliography like? Who does the author cite? Oh, the author is citing a person whose work has been superseded. And the hate type continues in that manner. So of course the greed type would have, if the greed type is talking with another greed type, presumably and saying, this is a really fantastic book, and the other greed type would say, oh, that's great, let me read it. Again, the hate type is a bit more sort of, you say, taking things more in stride. As a hate type, that's how they explore and engage. They distance themselves, moving the object away from them so that they can actually bring it into focus. This is their way of gaining a foothold into the material of that book. But the greed type, who recommended this book, says, why do you always have to criticize everything? The hate type responds, but I wasn't criticizing. I was finding my way into the book. That's my way of engaging, not only books, but most subjects I'm drawn to. I seem to first take a critical stance in order to assess it. This is a typical example of how these two personality types might interact. This is quite funny. It's somewhat familiar. So, of course, and the point here also is not as if we're going to, like in the zodiac, we're going to say, well, I'm a Virgo and I'm a Sag or whatever. That's not really the point. It's not as if we're going to say, okay, I am in one way or another, but it's more just to assess that this is what's operating within the mind. Also to just more have an, you could say, an aerial perspective of what's happening. So we are less prone to sort of launch into solidifications, or like we're talking about here, fixation about either our own personality or that of others. It's really just to understand the sort of constructed way that some of the conditions basic to how we construct our perceptions and interact. So then there's the ignorance type. Ignorant or delusional types may be thought of in two ways. First, and most broadly, one can say that all beings are ignorant insofar as they do not yet comprehend reality. So that's a good place actually to begin. If we're going to say delusional types, we should make it clear that we're all equally delusional. And what we mean is that our experience lacks insight into how things are, which is what then drives the condition of suffering, samsara. So continuing then, going on with further defining that, Steven says, this not knowing, avidya, is said to bind beings to the wheel of suffering. Unbinding from that is often called an awakening, bodhi, from the sleep of delusion. So this is where we have then, in relation to this condition of ignorance on the most basic level, we then have the opposite, which would be the complete absence of ignorance, which is then what we mean with bodhi. So that's where we talk about awakening. Secondly, and more narrowly, there are beings called tortured ones or hungry ghosts who have been so traumatized that they feel neither safe to merge with something, as do greed types or attractive types, nor safe to distance themselves from things, as do hate or distancing types. They're somewhat shut down. We might reflect here on a positive extreme case of ignorance, on what it might be like to be an extremely deluded type, in the sense of not being able to discern what is real or true. So in the words of my perfect teacher by Rinpoche, there is a wonderful discussion where he takes the example of the hungry ghost, a Praetor, which is one of the modes of sentience in samsara. In Rinpoche's discussion, he talks about how samsara is not spiritual, beneficial to engage with, and he goes on to say a Praetor is dominated by terror and hallucinations. For them, there's no basis for distinguishing what is real from what is not, and this causes a pattern of terror in the entire organism. It's said that the dominant upset that characterizes a Praetor is an avarice that can never be satisfied. We might think that this represents a greed type, but these are only categories. We can be a bit loose. The idea here, from a psychological point of view, is that there is an underlying terror for those who have been so shut down due to physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse. It's known very well. So of course, when Rinpoche describes the 6 realms, they all are driven by basically these 3 conditions, either attachment, aversion, or ignorance. When we present this in the modern context, it doesn't really work, because this is part of a cosmology that's entirely foreign to us. And that's where we famously then have persons like Chogyam Trungpa who would discuss this experience in terms of the you could say, key psychological disposition that creates this kind of experience. And that's where then when we talk about the Praetor, we would more talk about Praetor mentality in terms of how it exists within our present experience, and how avarice, as Steven talks about here, greed, if you like, or stinginess rather, actually is something that shapes our experience and our psychology. So in our present modern day context, being, you could say, not in our cosmology, there's no understanding of the 6 realms as actually manifest locations, then we rather just speak of these in terms of the psychological dispositions that create this kind of experience. So when we have when we have the classical point of view, from Rinpoche, he speaks about it just as if, if you're going to go to Nepal, they're going to tell you to get, don't drink the water. They're going to tell you to, dress in layers. If you're going hiking, they're going to tell you to be careful with making sure the salad is well washed and all of that. That's where we're talking about an actual place. So that's where as far as Rinpoche is concerned, here we're talking about actual locations. The thing is, from the Buddhist point of view, the entire realm, the entire world of samsara is created by the mind. And so to speak about Nepal or to speak about the Praetor realm is pretty much the same thing. But of course, what is implicit both in the way that Chögyam Trungpa would present the psychological, you could say, disposition that creates this, and what Rinpoche is talking about, is that there's a basic delusional condition that drives these experiences. So whether we're just thinking about it in terms of our ordinary everyday life, or this life, or people around us, or actual, you could say, destinations, locations, we are talking about a deluded condition that projects solidity. And what we're onto here is then analyzing, and you could say dismantling the notion of solidity around these kind of experiences and attitudes. So then Steven goes on to say, dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder, might be understood as an extreme form of the deluded or ignorance type, where the fixity is closed and split because it's not safe to be either a greed or hate type. For them, it's not safe to be a type that merges, because to be present and to merge may mean total annihilation. Nor is it safe to make distinctions, because this may be monitored and sensed by someone who will come and annihilate them. It's not safe to relax, and it is not safe to put one's voice forward, so to speak. So these beings survive by not being present at all. Okay, I didn't know that, but this is then clearly how dissociative identity disorder works, and how this is related to the ignorance type then. So a student once asked me to translate a question to a Tibetan Lama. She asked, how do you give direct introduction to the nature of mind to someone with multiple personalities? So I tried to think how to translate multiple personalities, and I came up with somebody who has many minds. Thereupon the Lama laughed and said, multiple, but we can't even say there's one mind. So this, of course, is more on the absolute level, but that's in fact true, and we can say we don't have one mind. We have this we're going to look at. We have as many minds as there are moments. Okay. Tatata. Like when we say Tathagata, we say tata ta. So that means suchness or reality. Buddha nature. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So this is then presently we're going to talk about what's underlying. So in the midst of you could say these three types, there is that which is not entangled in these styles of delusion. So this is, you could say, the opposite to the delusional condition that's basic to samsara altogether. And that's where we talk about Buddha nature. Steven says, once again, our goal is to repeatedly manifest the direct perception of reality rather than changing our personality. So then, what is reality? The Tibetan term that was sometimes used for reality is deshin ni. In Sanskrit, it is tatata, meaning thusness. One of the name of the Buddha is the Tathagata, one who has thus gone, or went like this. And we are encouraged to reflect that this understanding of Tathagata is our true nature. We have the nature and capacity to go like this. In Sanskrit, this is called Tathagata Garbha. So here we're talking about penetrating to the actual nature of our being and the actual nature of things. And this is then the scope of someone who is awake. So we refer to this condition as tatata, and someone who has experiences tathagata. And then we talk about then this disposition or this potential that we all have innately, which possesses this lack of confusion, as tathagata garbha. And Stephen goes on to say, garbha means we have the potential or the capacity to move, to change, to develop like this. This means as the Buddha did. In the technical sense, Buddha was not a person. It instead means the open, luminous state that never undergoes suffering, that is sometimes called awakened. So this is talking about the ground that's basic to all sentient beings, but not recognized then, which is veiled. And then during the condition of being a confused sentient being, wandering in samsara, this underlying disposition remains as a potential. But we would say, nevertheless, even though it remains hidden for us, it is actually what we truly are. So to unveil this is then the scope of the Buddhist path. Stephen goes on to say, the Buddhist teaching clearly say that enlightenment cannot be different from reality. So to directly encounter or perceive reality and to have full and complete realization is the same thing. So when we say tathagata, or we say enlightenment, this is what we mean. This is awakening to what actually is. So Stephen is saying, of course, I simplify. The analogy that is often given for enlightenment is the sky. The sky does not change. Whether or not one is a Shravakayana follower, the sky is still the same. So that means regardless of who we are, then this underlying nature is unchanging. Stephen says reality itself does not have the label Buddhist, Hindu, or Jewish. In a text called the Uttara Tantra, the Sublime Continuum, it is said that this Buddha nature, this reality, which is our innermost essence, is the great self, Mahatman, beyond both the self of non-Buddhists and also beyond the not-self of Buddhists. This, of course, is interesting because there we have the squabbling that happens between Buddhists and you could say those who follow Vedanta. And the Vedanta people can very justifiably argue that that Buddha nature sounds awfully much like the pure consciousness that is spoken about in Vedanta. So there is a bit back and forth, but we would generally say that in the various teachings that the Buddha gave, then the teaching that stresses no self is very much aimed at the naive assumptions of a solidity or a fixity, both with regards to our own disposition and with regards to the perceived phenomena. So when we emphasize emptiness and no self at this point, it is to penetrate some assumptions, some deluded assumptions. But penetrating that, then of course something is unveiled. And this disposition that is unveiled, while it's not held by the deluded condition of self and the duality between self and other, it constitutes a real condition of non-confusion, which then in the Uttara Tantra is actually referred to as the great self. And we would say this self is it's pure, it's permanent, and so on. So that's where there might be some misunderstanding that then takes place, then saying, hey, wait a minute, didn't you just say there was no self? But in fact, it is saying the same thing. The self that we're talking about here is that condition which is beyond any kind of notion of what we earlier established as extremes, such as existing, not existing, and so on. And we're basically talking about the condition of awakening. Whereas when we're analyzing and establishing no self, this is to penetrate the assumptions of the unawakened or deluded state. So Stephen then says, Buddhists ask themselves the same question. What is the true invariant nature of this reality, this Buddhist nature? They knew they weren't alone in the world. They lived among those with different views, and they wonder, do those who are not Buddhists have Buddha nature? And they indeed understood that non-Buddhists and Buddhists have the same essential abiding capacity to overcome all suffering. So this, of course, would happen, and this sounds terribly sort of petty-minded and sectarian, but there probably would be Buddhists who would think like that. You know, maybe only enlightenment is for those who have joined the Buddhist club or something like that. So Stephen says we should not be surprised that even Shravaka Jnanists have Buddha nature from the perspective of Mahayana. Even eternalists have Buddha nature. Even nihilists, all bodhisattvas, all mahasiddhas, all serial killers, and all suicide bombers have Buddha nature. If you think this isn't fair or not right, go argue with Maitreya, who authored the Uttara Tantra. Oh, good luck. The famously Asanga, who actually wrote down the teachings from Maitreya that we have, he's actually spent 12 years meditating with the intention that as his goal, he wished to encounter the Bodhisattva Maitreya. And he succeeded. But it took 12 years, and he went through a lot of hardships. So it might be difficult to go and argue with Maitreya, but of course, then again, what is said here is that this nature is basic to anybody. And so, yes, it includes anything from bodhisattvas to suicide bombers. It permeates all of what we call samsara, and as such, it's the ground nature beyond both samsara and nirvana. So we would say this nature is not improved through the spiritual path. It's not improved through attaining enlightenment. And it's also not diminished through wandering in samsara or through having afflicted conditions of mind. So this nature remains unconditional, regardless of samsara and nirvana. It's basic to Buddhas and sentient beings. When we judge others as good or bad, and to be human is to judge, our judgment never touches their Buddha nature. It is now accepted, especially in the Mahayana traditions, that all living beings, not only humans, have this Buddha nature. It is a precious thing. That is why, in part, it is considered a grave karmic error to kill or hurt other living beings. So in the Mahayana tradition, it is a vow and a form of mental training to honor the Buddha nature of all living beings. From an Abhidharma point of view, the way to do this is to find a way to directly perceive reality, because what blocks us from being able to directly perceive the reality of our own Buddha nature is the wrong view of the way things are. So this, of course, comes back to the fact that we don't see our Buddha nature and we don't see the Buddha nature in others, is because we're caught up in our own confused projections. So, of course, what we're doing with the Abhidharma is trying to penetrate these assumptions. Some of these assumptions, you could say, are inculcated through our education, our conditioning in this life, and others are even more basic than that. Coming back, Stephen then says, coming back to our discussion of conditioned versus unconditioned dharmas, this reality, which we are encouraged to directly perceive, is an unconditioned dharma. It's said that the Abhidharma is high because it leads to a complete spiritual transformation, one that will not change. When we say high here, that's just what we mean when we say Abhi. It means the high dharma. So it just means that this is, you could say, the highest of teachings in the sense of explaining the very core of reality and also the means to unveil this core of reality. The other teachings that we have from the Buddha, what we call the baskets, the three baskets, is that we have the sutra teachings, which are instructions on the path, and the Vinaya teachings, which are, you could say, instructions on lifestyle. So the first is more about, the first two are more about what we do in terms of how we handle ourselves, how we practice the path. But the Abhidharma is actually tells us what is the path about. So we could say the Abhidharma is what we would want to study to begin with, because it gives us a view and a sense of direction. It's not the territory, but it nevertheless maps the the journey and the reason why we would undertake the spiritual path. Steven then says, this, referring to Abhidharma, it leads to the direct perception or realization of reality. This reality is not only a problem for us here, it has been an intellectual problem for countless Buddhist practitioners. To put it in a nutshell, how do we know whether this reality is the reality that is being talked about? Upon what basis do we decide what enlightenment is? I don't say this to discourage us, but to suggest it is very deep and profound. So reality, full and complete enlightenment, our Buddha nature, a state that is unconditioned by causes, all of these terms more or less speak of the same thing. So this is where, of course, we could say, well, how do we know that we're on the path? Well, as far as practitioners of meditation, we would say it's the grasping mind that wants to be confirmed. And generally, we would say, as far as practicing the path goes, once we have an idea of what we're doing, then we proceed without necessarily, while we are practicing, entangling ourselves in speculations about what we're doing. But at the same time, we have to have a clear vision of what it is that we're doing in terms of what it is that drives our confusion and what it is that drives awakening from confusion. So once there was, remember once someone asked Jigme Rinpoche, Rinpoche, what's nirvana like? And Jigme Rinpoche was not exactly someone who likes to sort of blow his own horn, to say the least. It's a rather humble, but extremely brilliant teacher. And he says, I don't know anything about nirvana, but he said, I certainly know that the moment that I'm not entangled with my aggression, I feel so much better. So on a very ordinary, immediate level, we can see that there are definitely places that we go that are more muddled and confused and destructive. And there's places where we could, or rather, there's things we could do where we would be less confused. And that indicates really the basic disposition, basic to us, that we can intuit a condition within ourselves that naturally is better off without this sort of overlay of pain and confusion. So in this way that we could intuit logically, in terms of our own experience, the presence of Buddha nature. Okay, let's see. Okay, someone says, may I ask, what is the difference between the ground of all sentient beings and the alaya ground you mentioned before? We're pretty much the same, even though we sometimes do talk about something called the primordial ground, which is before Buddhas and sentient beings, and which is the place from which you can say everything manifests. This is the very ground within our own disposition that is completely uncontaminated and clean. Now, when this nature is fully realized for what it is, then we have someone who is awake, or a Buddha. And when it's not realized for what it is, then we have a sentient being. And that sentient being, not seeing the primordial ground for what it is, actually has a disposition that is a sort of a dull, or you could say a veiled ground, which is then what we call the alaya, the ground consciousness. And it's within this condition then that we have all the memories and all the various habitual patterns and so on, which are stored. This is why, for example, in dreams, we might all of a sudden remember something, or something might come up that was conditioned by events that happened a long time ago. Sometimes for no reason whatsoever, we remember something. And even presently, the very ground that we actually assert as being the foundation of who we are, the very basis for the sense of I, where we have this sense of duality, where we construct a separation between self and other, that we would say also is the all ground. And it's within this all ground then that we have this sense of affliction, this condition of then having happy and unhappy psychological states. And then also what we're going to be looking at now, it's also within this that we then experience various kinds of consciousness. And the next chapter is going to be about these different consciousnesses. The cosmology of the Praetor sounds very wounded. I've heard DJK say musicians are often Praetors. Is that why those who have often experienced physical or psychological harm make great music? And dissociative disorders are fragmented because their consciousness has been split through repeated trauma, hence multiple personality disorder, which is now identified as severe PST. Well, the last part I can't really say anything about. That's probably right. You probably know more about this than I do. As far as the Praetor condition, and this is not really, yes, we could say the Praetor is part of you could say a larger cosmology that understands the nature of consciousness, but within our particular cosmology, you know, we see the world in terms of being constructed through, you could say, matter and materialist causes. So yes, that's a whole different kettle. You could say the division between these two cosmologies. But the Praetor situation, which we can experience within our present life, is one of feeling poverty. So that's where that we have this sense of inferiority and we need something. So the Praetor is never satisfied. There's always this sense of loss and not having enough, can't give away. So that's where we have this this situation of the Praetor, and the psychological state then is this condition of feeling poverty. So yes, but of course, very often in terms of art, then, you know, particularly in Western art, then so much of the art is driven by psychological pain. So so for sure, there's got to be some great Praetor musicians and artists. So is the Alaya ground the same as the primordial ground, or contaminated, so to speak, but not recognized for what it is? Yes, that's actually what we mean with the Alaya. So when we talk about the Alaya, we say it's a bit like the night sky, because the night sky is really just the nature of the sky, but veiled. So it's the same place, but it's just not seen for what it is. So yes, we could say the Alaya is like the night sky, and the sky itself is the primordial ground. We could say that. When we say a state beyond self and non-self, do we mean the state of dependent origination? In other words, emptiness? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, here we're talking ontology. So this is a condition, you could say, that objectively exists as the nature of all reality, that it's dependently arisen. It's empty, sure. But when we talk about self, you see, that's where we talk about what we impute on this condition. And that's done by the subject. So that's where we could say, yes, that is a state, in the sense of this is an experience that we have when we misconstrue reality. But yes, that reality that we're misconstruing, we understand that. If we analyze, then we can see there's, whenever we subject anything to analysis, we begin to see its conditions. And that's why we discover the nature of dependent origination and emptiness. Referring on page 58 to, quote, when we judge others as good or bad, we can never touch their Buddha nature. Does this imply that when we can attempt to embrace others with compassion, the realm of their Buddha nature can or might be touched? We could say that, because the moment that we're embracing somebody with compassion, we're already stepping outside of our ordinary duality. We're already softening the rigid stance that is, you could say, self-centering. So of course that doesn't necessarily have to be the case with compassion, but assuming it is what we call bodhicitta, assuming it is, you could say, compassion in its best, it's the best kind of compassion, then we are, you could say, perceiving the Buddha nature of others to a far greater degree. And this is not only philosophical, but this is even how we interact with people. This is why compassion always works much better, because we have a much more warm, soft, accommodating, potentially playful, and intelligent way of interacting with the other when we engage with compassion. So yeah, the judgment, as good and bad, doesn't really help. Is primordial ground before the skandhas, before the nidanas? Yes, that's actually where the skandhas, you could say, take place. And this is where then, on the basis of not understanding the primordial ground, we then freeze it into self and other, and that's where we then have the first skandha, the skandha of form. And it's also before the nidanas. Yes, that is before the 12 links of dependent arising takes place. The primordial ground is the ground that is uncontaminated and which is then misperceived on the basis of what Stephen also was saying here, the first nidana, which is avidya, or ignorance. There's a question from the live studio audience.
If bodhi means awakening, what's bodhicitta?
So the question is, if bodhi means awakening, what's bodhicitta? Well, it's the same bodhi, but it's chitta then means heart. And it really means that you could say the condition of bodhi is the uncontaminated awake condition, and the heart of that is what we already presently could intuit or appreciate. So we could say the path that is informed by bodhi, we could call bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is this motivation that's the magnanimous quality that the bodhisattva develops, that has both an understanding of the reality of phenomena and also cares for sentient beings. So it has the two qualities of wisdom and compassion. Yeah. But it's very much what we would say is the intention on the path, where bodhi is you could say the absolute, we would say the Buddha is Buddha because the Buddha has realized bodhi. So it's the same word as Buddha and bodhi is the same. Buddha is someone who has realized bodhi. And someone on the path who's a bodhisattva is then, you could say, what drives their path is this bodhicitta. In the West, chitta is often translated as mind, whereas in the East, chitta is translated as heart. Quite interesting. Yes, these Westerners. It's true. It's true. Yeah. Then again, a mind. If we are to find the Sanskrit word for mind, we would also say this is chitta. So it's a little bit about semantics, but yes, we like heart. Yeah. But we also have to contend with there is this thing called the mind. So I think either works, but yes. 6 channels of perception. Okay. So Stephen says, now according to the Abhidharma, the whole apparatus of our experiences works through 6 channels of perception. That is, through our 5 sense-based faculties and 1 non-sense-based faculty. So that basically means the 5 senses and then the mind. So this is what we probably in the West, it doesn't really work to say the 6th sense, because then we might think of some sort of horror movie or something like that. But it is actually something that is equally a faculty and equally a sense perception, because we know what we're thinking. And there are thoughts that arise, and there are us who are, you could say, witnesses to or observers who perceive thoughts. So that's just like any other consciousness, really. So hence we have these 6 channels. So the first one, obviously, the first 5 have to do with what's tangible in terms of seeing, hearing, and so forth. The last one is less tangible. So seeing is one of the ways in which we obsess. Let's be very precise. We have the habit of seeing something and we hope it will last, or we fear it will last. We hope something we see is unique or independent, or we fear that what we see is unique or independent. So that's with regards to what we are seeing. Then we impute this label of there being an identity, that it's something that is unconditional and something that's lasting. So again, these three factors of uniqueness or identity, independence, and permanence. So that's where, on the basis of that, if we like it, we hope it's going to have all of that. And if we don't like it, then it worries us that it has all of these. Basically, then, we are talking about how we are deluded in our perceptions, or the way that we interpret our perceptions. Seeing means, very concretely, anything that we experience, remember, or contact that has shape and hue. We're not talking about movement at this point. It's more like a freeze frame. Movement is a bit of a fiction, and we invest a lot in this fiction. Even a film is just one frame after the other. The trick is to move them at the rate of 24 frames a second, and then there is this fiction that is corresponding to the way things are. But in a scientific mode of analysis, it's just frames or pictures. Don't obsess about what you're seeing, mind the gap. So that is where we would say arhats and persons who have a certain, you could say, lack of confusion, they would actually understand the momentary phenomena without necessarily mistaking that there is some sort of solid continuity. So that's where we would say the object of seeing is form. Yeah. Second is then hearing. So that's where the object is sound. According to the basic classification of hearing in the Abhidharma, there are 4 divisions: hearing nice sounds, hearing not nice sounds, hearing sounds that are produced with intention, and hearing sounds that arise due to no intention, like earthquakes or rain. But for all this wide variety of things heard, we obsess. We hope and fear in the same way, thinking of it as fixed, unique, or autonomous. So then 3, smelling. Another channel for our obsessional activity is that of smelling. Again, the basic classification is smells that we like and smells that we don't like. Now, Stephen here uses the word obsession, which we might kind of say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not particularly obsessive. But that's not really the point. The point is that we fix, and there where he uses the word earlier, he used the word fixity. And that's the point here, is that we're not actually interacting with phenomena because we're veiling them on the basis of our projections that come about through this quality of fixating. And that's why we can talk about obsessional. It's not necessarily that it's pathological or that there's a sort of a value judgment in this, but it's more that we need to understand that this is where we go wrong. This is where there's a delusion taking place. So that's why we use words like that. 4, tasting. We have sweet, sour, bitter, salty, pungent, and astringent tastes. More or less, all human beings have these ways of making distinctions about tasting. Between smelling and tasting, there develops the career of a gourmand, possibly a gourmet, but anyway, someone who obsesses about minute differences of taste and smell. We again hope and fear with respect to the fixity, uniqueness, and autonomy of various tastes and smells. Touching. There is interior and exterior touch. Interior touch is what we call hunger pangs, the grumbling of the stomach, and certain kinds of movement with respect to orifices. If you had stomach problems, it would be this channel of touch. Here, we don't talk about the mental component, but just the physical component of being sick. You can do an entire analysis of being sick according to the working along these channels. Okay. 6, cognitive and affective aspects. This channel 6 includes all possible experiences which are not sense-based, mental as distinguished from the five senses. It includes both what we call mental factors and also affective emotional factors. We might say there are affective and cognitive aspects that have a common channel that is separate from seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching, including joy, anger, hatred, fear, shame, sadness, guilt, and so on. Cognitive aspects are thought, insight, doubt, remembering, and so on. So this is then the dimension of the intangible dimension of the mental. So we have on one hand just the purely the mental factors, and then also we have then the with that we have emotional affective factors such as you know, liking and disliking and so on. And it's on the basis of that then that we have this strong sense of I, the strong sense of my likes, my dislikes. And essentially that's what drives all the toxic state of mind, where we could say there is a purely cognitive aspect where we just register or we observe or we have some perception, again, taking place within the mind. So in sum then, there are 6 channels through which our obsessional habits run. According to the traditions of the Abhidharma kosha, our cravings and thirsts don't run anywhere else. They're only activated along 6 channels. We might call this a hexamodel of experience. Obsessional modes of experience, which are the cause of suffering in terms of channels, are everything in terms of fixity, singularity, or independence. Part of getting into recovery and becoming sober from the drunken, casual habits of non-scientific inquiry is to learn precisely how everything we experience is experienced only as moments of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and this famous number 6, which I like to call other, defined as neither seeing, nor hearing, nor smelling, nor tasting, nor touching. So again here, then Steven is referring to the overall project, which is for us, you could say, as sentient beings to recover, to get out of our samsaric obsession and addiction. And in that sense, there is then the steps of the path, but there's basic to what we're operating with then is this fundamental delusional condition where we fixate, we identify as, you could say, singular, and we attribute solidity or unconditional reality to whatever it is that we then perceive in terms of these 6 channels. All right. Heart, mind, bodhicitta, the awakened heart. Yeah. As practitioners of the Bodhisattva Jnana path, should we try to engage with people and be more social and interactive? Many example practitioners of the path seem to have not social at all. Well, as someone who's committed to the Bodhisattva Jnana path, we're never going to retreat into some private little comfortable nirvana. And that's where we take the Bodhisattva vow. We're never going to do that. So if presently there's some need to practice retreat, like some of the sages of the past did, that's excusable and explainable. It's just like if we're in recovery, then we might, you know, then we might be taking some time out. That's legit. But the bottom line is we are committed to all sentient beings, and we're never going to retreat into nirvana. And from that point of view, then we are the ultimate, bodhisattvas are the ultimate social animals as such, in that they even though they might temporarily work on themselves, then their ultimate commitment is all sentient beings. So we don't necessarily at this point have to worry too much about this. we are in touch with people, and it would be nice if we are kind to them, if we're not rigid, and in general, if we practice the 6 parameters: generosity, discipline, patience, energy, concentration, and prajna, and so on. If we apply all of that, particularly you could say generosity and patience, they're quite helpful in dealing with others around us, and particularly also obviously compassion, wishing them well, wishing them to be free from suffering, and loving kindness, wishing them happiness. Okay. All right. We'll dedicate. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore and more. Thank you. We'll just take a 2-minute break, and then we'll talk a little bit about meditation, and then we'll practice meditation. There's a last question here. Are the 6 factors, the 5 aggregates, and mind? Yes, that's what we're talking about today. These 6, what Steven calls the 6 channels. Yeah. Oh, wait a minute. The 5 aggregates and mind. No, the 5 aggregates, that's something completely different. Yeah. These mental, the sort of generally mental factors and so on, they belong to the 4th skandha, impulse. Anyway, we'll be looking at that, the samskaras. Yeah. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. Anyway, these classifications we'll be returning to. So 6 factors. I don't know if there's 6 factors somewhere. Today we've talked about basically 6 consciousnesses. Yeah. So okay, the 6 consciousness. Okay, there's the mental factors, which are what we talk about as the generally 51 mental factors. They fall under the heading of the 4th skandha, impulse. These are, you could say, the place where then our sense of self gains momentum, and that's what we call the mental factors. And today we looked at the overall consciousness. That's different. These are then the 6 consciousnesses. This belongs to the 5th skandha, which are then consciousness. Okay. All right. So 2-minute break, and then we'll go into meditation. Okay. So a little something about Buddhist meditation, which is really important in Buddhism, because that's where we go beyond. Stephen is talking about going beyond judgment and so on, which is not that easy. And as long as we're still entangled in our ordinary, the way that we function ordinarily, and the way that we ordinarily organize our psychology in terms of pretty much believing what we think and being rather, you could say, dominated by our thoughts, it's very difficult for us to not struggle with our thoughts. We're going to have impulses of like and dislike all the time. And if we just say to ourselves, well, I won't judge, this is very often we hear, oh, you're so judgmental. The implication is, okay, you should just, get over your get over your judgmentality. That's a very good thing, and I think by all means we should, but it's not that easy to fight the mind with the mind. And meditation actually provides a condition of us to stepping outside of the ordinary fixity, as Stephen calls it, of the mind. It's where we discover space. See, it can sometimes, if it's 5 p.m. and we're just about to go home and somebody sort of hits us with some heavy sort of accusation, it can be, that's the wrong time of the day, right? But if we go home and we relax and we're feeling chilled, and then somebody comes up with the same accusation or the same judgment or whatever, we possibly could handle it. If somebody comes with something after we are relaxed and we're open-minded, then the same input doesn't land so heavily. That's because we're not imputing the same degree of solidity, not imputing the same degree of dislike, and so on. So we can't change our circumstances necessarily, but what we can do to a large extent is work with our mind. And we can work with the one that is the recipient of whatever we perceive. And of course, what we're talking about here is we're suggesting, and that's in the Abhidharma in Buddhist philosophy altogether, is actually to look at our assumption about the solidity of things. And that's where we apply analysis. And that's where analysis is very helpful in terms of us actually getting the message. Things don't really exist the way they appear. We can have various prejudices. And of course, what we see in the political arena is that when things get polarized, is that one party perceives and fixates on the other as having a particular view, a particular disposition, a particular agenda, and so on, and vice versa. And so that's where you could say solidity doesn't really help us. Not only it's not, you could say, conducive for solutions and so on, but it's also, it's basically flawed. There is no such a thing as a solid reality if we analyze it. Whenever we analyze anything, and this could be your homework, try and analyze any given phenomenon, whether it's a thought or whether it's a physical thing, and see if it exists unconditionally. Anyway, that is an intellectual exercise that hopefully achieves us having less faith and being less submissive to and controlled by our assumptions. And that letting go of our assumptions is quite healthy in every way. But it's important for us to realize that it's not just about us becoming nicer people, but it's actually about us beginning to see reality more clearer, being less deluded. And what we're doing with the practice of meditation, and we can do that with this insight, and that's where it would help what we call vipassana. It would help us to have a more wide perspective in terms of what we perceive. The practice of meditation is essentially learning to not be tangled up in and driven by our thoughts. The narratives that arise in the mind, the thoughts and so on, we very often get completely absorbed in them. And it's as if we begin to live in a bubble of our own perceptions, attitudes, etc. So the practice of meditation is a very friendly way for us to actually begin to connect with reality, to actually break out of this bubble. So the practice of meditation, there's nothing not to like about it in terms of just having peace of mind and being calmer, being more contented and so forth. The practice of mindfulness is extremely helpful. In terms of the path to enlightenment, it's also indispensable because it's in this place that we actually begin to see clearer. We might have a vision of the nature of how things are, but unless we actually integrate this within our being, then it could very well just be left as a memory. It could just be a thought. And we could say, well, this is my attitude. And it's become sort of a thought that we repeat again and again. It becomes part of our identity or our dogma or our opinions and so forth. But it's really just a thought that we keep conjuring up. So in this way, for us to have an insight, it actually needs to be integrated through the practice of meditation. We would say, if we are advanced practitioners and we're great yogis and so on, we can meditate under all circumstances. But in general, it's quite helpful to have this exercise of sitting. So that's why in the Buddhist tradition, from the time of the Buddha down until now, then there is this practice of meditation. People from the outside might say, these Buddhists, they're weird. They just sit there and they don't do anything. But in fact, what you're doing is really just connecting. It's the exact opposite of what it looks like. It's not turning inside. It's not navel gazing. It's not disconnecting. It is, in fact, connecting, because that's a place where you could say there's not the interference of the various kinds of confused projections that arise in reaction to all our various perceptions. So that's where we begin to actually ground ourselves. And on the basis of that, then we integrate this within the world. And we can see how this then enables us to be far more effective, to be far more clear, far more compassionate, far more participatory, far more engaged in the world. And that, of course, is the very nature of the Bodhisattva path, is this complete unreserved engagement with the world, with all sentient beings. So the practice of meditation is extremely helpful. And it is really the foundation of everything we do on the path. Last time we looked at His Holiness Juju Rinpoche's, what is it again? It was called The Play of Thoughts, where His Holiness essentially talks about the need for us to be aware of three things. One is that we have moving thoughts, but if we are aware that they're happening, then actually we are still abiding. And that's where we could actually have a condition of abiding in which then the thoughts have less power. When we are aware of the arising of thoughts, then we naturally dwell. And within that, then there's a sense of no conflict, and simply just we are present. But when we're not aware, that's when the arising of thoughts, they then begin to control us. And that's where then the experience of samsara then happens. In the scriptures, it says, thoughts are what plunge us into the ocean of samsara. It's not so much the thoughts as such, but it's the dualistic thoughts. When we're not aware of what arises, and we then begin to get absorbed by the arising of the thoughts, that's where we lose our ground. But with awareness, then we begin to have some connection to be properly present in whatever we're doing and with whatever arises. So that's why His Holiness, he was talking about these three aspects, which is movement, stillness, and awareness. So regardless of how the mind is, we sustain this quality of awareness. And this is also, like His Holiness was saying, this is really the foundation of all the paths. Without that, anything that we do, even if we might be doing all sorts of advanced Vajrayana yoga practice, or we might be doing sadhana or whatever, without this quality of awareness, then all these activities just becomes activities. They could sow seeds, we could sow seeds of virtue, but real insight doesn't really happen. It just becomes just, you could say, actions that, of course, lay seeds in the sense of laying down karmic dispositions, but they don't actually free us. So we need to have this foundation of meditative stability regardless of what we're doing. So the practice of meditation then has these two aspects. One is that we sit, and with the sitting we provide a framework, a physical framework of calm. So that's why we sit. This is where we would have the various aspects of the posture, and then we focus on the breath. We can focus on different things. We can focus on something that we visualize. We can focus on an external object, and but in the various Buddhist traditions, there's very often the recommendation to focus on the breath. So then again, in some traditions, there's instructions on anapana and so forth, where you focus on just the place where the nostrils and so forth. In the instructions that we have from Chogyam Trungpa, and basically based on the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions, we particularly go with the out-breath. And this is because the out-breath takes us out of the notion of just the centering on ourself and engages us with the space. So in that way, we unite space and awareness. So the out-breath is quite helpful to as our point of reference point, and it really is what anchors us. We need this aspect of shamatha, or calm abiding, that there's something that we come back to. Just sort of leaving the mind to just be present could work, but it could also result in us not really having a direction when we're sitting. So just simply coming back to the breath, even though it is, you could say, a reference point, it is nevertheless ultimately non-conceptual. It's not something philosophical, it's something very real, tangible. So that's where we focus on the out-breath, and as the breath exits from our nostril, fusing with space, we then relax into that and just allow the in-breath to happen. And again, focusing on the out-breath, we have this proactive presence with being aware of the out-breath. As far as the thoughts that arise then, as we're sitting, then we allow whatever arises. We have no worries about what the thoughts might be. Of course, we might have thoughts that we don't like, but here we actually train in more being concerned with coming back to the breath, the quality of the space, the content of the thoughts. We simply acknowledge thoughts. They might be ugly thoughts, thoughts about compassion and universal love and like that. But regardless, we're not objectifying and fixating on whatever arises. Our whole condition of samsara comes about from this sense of I and my experience. And on the basis of likes and dislikes, we further solidify and fixate. And that is where it's not very helpful to have this relationship with what arises in our mind. And that's where we lose sight of what is arising in the mind. We lose sight of where we are. We basically get encapsulated in a little bubble of our own attitudes and thoughts. And this perpetuates this condition of fixating on ourselves. The quality of training ourselves in not being fixating on the thoughts that arise enable a much warmer, much more, you could say, connected, real relationship with ourselves and the world around us. It discontinues this rigidity around ourselves. So as thoughts arise, we have no preference, and in the instructions of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, we would just label them thinking. We would just say that's thoughts. So that enables us to appreciate thoughts without having to escape from them, but at the same time, we also don't get absorbed in them. And that is where it can be quite helpful to just have the breath to come back to. Sometimes as we're meditating, and it might not be sometimes, it might be very often, we discover that we're lost in thought, and then we thought, oh, back to the breath, and that's completely normal. In the scriptures, we would compare this to a scroll that's been rolled up for a very long time, and if we sort of unfurl it and let go, it rolls right back onto itself. And similarly, also, our habit has been to be absorbed by our thinking. And so when we discover that we've been lost in thought or just distracted thinking, etc., it's not as if we need to be particularly despondent or feel that we're failed meditators. That's just normal. That's completely predictable. So that's where, as we recognize that we've been wandering, we are no longer wandering. That very recognition in and of itself is no longer being distracted. So we don't really need to follow up with further thoughts about analyzing how much we were distracted or what happened while we were thinking, what were we thinking of, and so on and so forth. That's just perpetuating confusion. But just to come back to that fresh moment of recognition, this is where we come back to an experience that is very palpable, very tangible, very real, and very open. And that, of course, then we begin to have thoughts about that, but that's where we might just then label whatever we think about that as thinking, and just sustain this simplicity of coming back to the breath. When we practice meditation this way, this is something that enables us to be freed. This is something that enables us to, you could say, draw a breath of relief. It's a sigh of relief. This enables us to connect with reality, and this is where we lose the ordinarily tiresome, the perpetual cycle of our thoughts, our reactive patterns, our afflicted states of mind, and so forth. So in this way, practicing meditation is something that is very invigorating. If we, like His Holiness Dudjom was saying last time, when we practice meditation, then naturally what happens is we have these experiences of non-thought, bliss, and clarity. And if we don't have that, then it's probably because we are subtly getting caught up in our thoughts. And that's where then meditation could be something quite strenuous and tiresome. But if we train ourselves in meditating properly, and we sustain this exercise of not being distracted, then we begin to gain some sense of autonomy and some sense of freedom from our thoughts. It doesn't mean that we have less thoughts, but it means that we're less worried about the thoughts that come up, and we sustain this condition of presence. So this basically meditation enables us, again, despite what it looks like, it enables us to get out of our heads. It actually enables us to get out of our thoughts. So meditation is something this, again, despite what it might look like as navel gazing and so on, it's actually the very opposite. So with the practice of meditation, this is where we gain this wider perspective beyond ourselves that we then refer to as vipassana. So we sometimes say that the method is shamatha and the outcome is vipassana. And of course, ultimately, vipassana is not limited to the time that we're sitting. So we actually bring this clarity into our post-meditation, and the degree to which we could integrate this clarity, this lack of attachment, this wider perspective in our ordinary life, to that extent, then we enhance this experience of vipassana. Now, another way to engage in this condition that's beyond ourself is through devotion. And this is very pronounced in the Vajrayana tradition, where there's a lot of emphasis on devotion to the teacher, devotion to the Buddha, and so forth. And this is, again, nothing to do with idolatry or seeking somebody that's going to look after us, but rather it's rejoicing and having a sense of awe and delight in that condition which is not entangled in our ordinary confusion. And so thinking of the Buddha or thinking of one's teacher could very well be a condition of rejoicing in some quality that lies beyond the ordinary confused mind. And so in the context of our practice here, we start off by doing this short practice called the Treasury of Blessings. But it's also basic to what we have in all the various Buddhist traditions, where before meditation, one would, for example, read the scriptures. This is what you do in the Theravadan tradition. You would read some scriptures, or you would practice something that actually engages the ordinary dualistic mind and brings it around to create the atmosphere, really, that's basic to the practice of meditation. So that's a little bit about meditation, and this, of course, is just a very brief summary of how meditation is practiced. But basically, in terms of the technique that I'm presenting here, we have these three aspects, which has to do with the body, the posture, the breath, attention to the breath, and then whatever thoughts arise, simply labeling them as thinking. And then specifically from His Holiness instructions last week, then as we were practicing, then we identify thoughts, and knowing that the thoughts are happening, then they don't stray into distraction, and that we could say is then where there is a condition of abiding, and that's on the basis of the third condition, awareness. So in this way, these three, what we sometimes refer to as abiding, movement, and stillness, is really basic to the way that we instruct in meditation. Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break and then we'll begin the practice. Thank you very much. Actually, somebody asks, hi Jakob, the Treasury of Blessing, is this something we should always do before sitting? Well, if you're doing the Nundro, then you needn't, but it is something that in general, if you're meditating, yeah, it's really good actually. This is something that sort of brings about a different atmosphere to the practice of sitting. Yeah. Okay. In the Buddha and the Dharma and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel lion throne, lotus, sun, and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the three Dharma robes, he sits in Bhadra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the light, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings circles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues, of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings. Ceaselessly and in every direction I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I'm accumulating now and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Yatao Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om 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 Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all living beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhamma Dhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual, and no nurturing of the self. May I realize the Dhamma where the self is not present. An entity such as gone to a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure. With an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's strife, and through the samadhi that is like Avatra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous Kaya and the Kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Treasury who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but go and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teachings live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukhani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat Yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata tavan mama stiti bhuyan jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, just to remind you once again, for those of you for whom it works in terms of the time, there's the sitting in the morning at 7 a.m., which also is followed by then what we just did, the Treasury of Blessings. And then we have study on Wednesday mornings, more about understanding Vajrayana. And then we have Bridget Gebbe's program on Shamatha and Vipassana meditation, which is on Saturdays from 3 to 4. And then there's a study of Longchen Rabjam's Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind from 5:30 to 6:30 on Sundays. So all of this is on the web page. But if you don't have the link, then you can always write to me and I'll send them to you. So these are study sessions, but they're also recorded, so you don't necessarily have to be there in real time. And I've probably forgotten some other things as well. Anyway, thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.
There's something